Think in a previous video, probably the one about Will Smith, Chris Rock, Hollywood, blah, 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 I mentioned that we needed to look towards real heroes, right? Not the self-centered little brats that play them on TV and movies. Well, I found one. Bet you never heard of this guy. And to be honest, he doesn't have that chiseled, perfect look of your favorite Hollywood actor. What's that old quote about books, judging, and covers? Something. This is U.S. Army Master Sergeant Benjamin F. Wilson. He was born on Vashon Island in Washington. It's near Seattle, June of 1921. He enlisted in the Army as soon as he was old enough to do so. He knew what he wanted to do, so his first posting was Oahu, Hawaii. He made it there just in time for Pearl Harbor. He wasn't at Pearl Harbor proper, though. He was a few miles north at Schofield Barracks. There were reports that this base was also strafed by Japanese Zeros during the attacks, so Ben might have seen a little bit of action there. Fortunately for the Imperial Japanese Army, that was the extent of the combat that Ben would see in World War II. Ben was a pretty smart dude. He was selected to attend Officer Candidate School, or OCS, in 1942. He graduated as an Army second lieutenant. He immediately requested combat. He didn't get that assignment and instead spent the rest of the war working as a training officer stateside. The war ended and he resigned his commission, returned home to Washington, and got a job at a lumber mill. The end. I'm just kidding. It's not the end. In 1950, Lil Kim invaded South Korea with 100,000 men. You guys probably heard of this, called the Korean War. They captured Seoul within 3 days. Ben probably read this on his lunch break at the lumber mill and got real happy. He went over to the Army recruiter, signed back up as a private, because Ben was ready for round two. In his short time since re-upping, he worked his way up from private to E8, Master Sergeant, again. While Ben was busy leveling up, UN forces landed in Incheon, defeated the North Korean army, whatever that is, liberated Seoul, and pushed the enemy all the way back to the Chinese border. Then the Chinese went a little nuts. Millions of Chinese troops started surging across the Yalu River, amped up on bat soup and loaded down with cheap hand grenades. The UN forces found themselves massively outnumbered, and they were suddenly on retreat. By June of 1951, the 31st Infantry Regiment was deployed outside of Nodong Rai along the 38th parallel, just trying to slow the Chinese advance and prevent the recapture of Seoul. Both sides were fighting like hell, and every inch of land was paid for in blood. The Chinese seemed to have an endless well of manpower to draw from, and things were looking pretty grim for the Allies. Ben arrived and was assigned Master Sergeant of 3rd Battalion, I Company. His first official mission was to retake a hill that overlooked the Washan Reservoir outside of Nodong Rai. The hill probably had an official number, but the popular name of it at the time was Hell Hill. Once Ben heard the name, he probably volunteered for that shit, knowing him. It was steep and heavily fortified by hundreds of North Korean and Chinese troops dug into defensive entrenchments. The enemy troops were probably feeling pretty good about their spot, and knew that their odds were good that any offensive up that hill would end in their favor. Little did they know that somewhere down below them, Ben stared at them through his horn-rimmed glasses with barely containable glee. Ben didn't see a heavily entrenched enemy. He saw opportunity. Master Sergeant Wilson had waited his entire life for this moment. He had an entire world war to make up for. Needless to say, the North Koreans never knew what hit them. Under covering fire from artillery, machine guns, mortars, and rifles, Ben gripped his, let out a primal battle cry, ordered the men of I Company to follow him. Charging forward up a steep, muddy incline in the dead heat of the Korean summer, Wilson was met immediately by an unrelenting barrage of machine gun and mortar fire that ripped up the scenery around him in every direction. Fearlessly ignoring the imminent death whizzing around him, Wilson led his men up the hill. Chucking hand grenades, firing his rifle, and then diving headlong into the first enemy entrenchment he could find. He came face to face with 4 guys carrying full auto SMGs, wasted them, then waited for the rest of his team to come up and reinforce the position. When his company arrived, consolidated, he issued a single order: fix bayonets. I can only imagine what was going through the minds of I Company when they heard that order, after doing what they had just done. So in true Ben fashion, charging forward with his sword gun, Ben and the men of I Company stormed up Hell Hill, with the explicit intention of fucking shit up. Heavy enemy fire came in from all directions, but Ben and his crew stormed ahead, hurled themselves at the enemy, and overran them, leaving nearly 30 Chinese and North Korean troops dead on the field. When the Chinese tried to counterattack, Ben single-handedly charged them, throwing grenades with one hand, pulling his pew lever with the other, killing 7 more guys, wounding 3, and driving off the attack by himself. Then Ben decided it was time to break for lunch. After he finished eating his sandwich, probably consisted of shrapnel mashed between 2 steel plates with a light sprinkling of jet fuel, Ben ordered a third charge. Ben had work to do. South Korea wasn't free yet. Ben closed the distance to his objective within 20 yards before he was hit with multiple bullets and shrapnel fragments. Wounded, exhausted, and unable to continue, his men grabbed him and pulled him back to the previously captured position. Ben was seriously wounded, so he did the only thing he could do. He yelled and cursed at the enemy while emptying his magazine in their general direction, while his buddies dragged him backwards. Once Ben arrived at the occupied position and was being laid onto a stretcher, he overheard that I Company's commander and the commander of 1st Platoon had been incapacitated. As a result, the attack up the hill was faltering. Ben, who was bleeding profusely from multiple gunshot and fragment wounds, climbed off the stretcher, ran back up the hill to lead the attack himself. Ben didn't have time to bleed. He grabbed the nearest rifle he could find and ran straight into the most ferocious fighting of the frontal attack. He began by shooting anything that moved, and then quickly followed that up with diving, bayonet first, into enemy forces. Wilson managed to kill 3 enemy troops in the hand-to-hand combat before the North Korean troops swarmed him. They wrenched his rifle from his grip, taking Ben's only firearm. They missed a spot, though. They didn't notice Ben's backup weapon. That was his shovel. Ben simply switched to his alternate and started dismantling his captors as they switched over into full flight mode and tried to flee. After dispatching his would-be captors with his shovel, E-tool, Ben grabbed his rifle, sat down on the side of the trench, and waved to his fellow company troops to come over and give him a hand with the whole walking out of a war zone thing. While being evacuated on another stretcher, Ben was wounded again and got mad. He had somehow found more ammo and was shooting from the stretcher while yelling orders at his men. I can imagine that the stretcher bearers were probably glad when he finally ran out of bullets, or they got too far away for his men to hear him. 4 days after surviving gunshot wounds and single-handedly killing at least 18 guys with bullets, grenades, and a gardening tool, Ben was already back on the firing line. He learned that communism hadn't been eradicated while he was lying in bed at the aid station, so he knew he still had plenty of work to do. Plus, he had only wiped out an entire platoon of North Korean troops by himself. That just wasn't going to cut it. Ben sets a high bar when it comes to life goals. Ben was once more ordered to lead the attack up Hell Hill. However, soon after approaching the enemy, his unit came under intense and direct gunfire from several enemy bunkers. The commies probably saw the dude with the glasses out front, leading the U.S. forces up the hill. Focusing fire on Ben's unit was probably more of a self-defense, I'm in fear of my life move than anything approaching practical warfare. For them at this point, I Company was soon pinned down and enemy mortars were bracketing them, moving closer with each splashed round. Notice I said I Company was pinned down. Nobody pins Ben. He leapt up from his spot at the front of the line, charged the nearest enemy bunker he could see, blew up the machine gun team with frags, shot a couple of other guys that were probably trying to dig through the earth to get away from him, hoping they could dig to America and be captured. Then hurtled past the bunker and engaged the support troops at danger close range. He killed 5 more troops, drove the others from their defensive positions, and inspired his guys to rush forward behind him, securing the objective. The ground was taken, the line was held. Over the course of these ultra-intense battles, Ben was credited with personally killing at least 27 enemy soldiers, capturing half a dozen heavily fortified entrenchments, surviving 2 serious wounds, and inspiring his troops with a kind of bravery and valor that you wouldn't even see in a story written in the Marvel comic universe. Probably goes without saying, but Ben was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions in those battles. Ben ended up surviving the entire Korean War, retired as a major in 1960. He and his family moved to Hawaii, and Ben passed away on 01 March 1988. He was in his 60s. Here's a picture of Ben and his family shortly after receiving the nation's highest military honor. I've heard it said that courage isn't the absence of fear, just that it is a judgment that something else is more important than fear. Ben might be the exception to that rule. He didn't just master his fear. He robbed it at gunpoint, beat it within an inch of its life, and left it naked in a dark alley covered by cardboard boxes. Ben's story shows us what true heroism is. It's not always tied up in a nice little bow, with only virtuous characteristics showing on the outside. It's loud, dirty, dark, and damn near inhuman. These are the conditions that allow heroic men to show us who they are and what we need to strive to imitate. Without adversity, we would not know what true heroism is. Shortly after his death, Ben arrived at Valhalla. He wandered around a little bit, talked to some of the other warriors there, then realized he was hungry. He was in the mood for some fried rice, and another resident recommended that he go check out the Chinese district, as they had the best fried rice he could find in the afterlife. Ben set off, and before long, he turned the corner of the street to an incredible open-air market, with Mandarin characters written on a beautiful banner hung over the street. Ben was perplexed. Chinatown seemed to have been evacuated, as if the residents had grabbed what they could and ran only hours ago. News travels fast in Valhalla, I guess.